Alrighty, good evening, everyone. It's just about 6:30, so I'll go ahead and get started. We might have some other folks trickle in. As folks are trickling in, please try to keep your microphones muted. We're so excited to have a live audience today as if it were in person. We try to embody that. So rather than having kind of Zoom conferences, we like to provide the opportunity for folks to unmute themselves during question and answer sessions and show your face if you feel comfortable. So welcome. I've got a couple housekeeping items. Just a reminder, this event is being recorded. Recordings of this event will be made available after the event through Eventbrite. I'll be sharing a link to that via email, so keep a lookout for that. Please mute your microphone during the presentations to avoid any background noise interfering with the speakers tonight. There will be a question and answer session after the end. That should say after the end of two presentations and at the end of the very end of the event. So we've got 4 presenters tonight. We'll do a question and answer session after the first 2 and then at the very end of the event tonight. Please post all your questions as they arise in the chat box, especially clarifying questions. So if you hear a term or a concept and want more information, please feel free to post it in the chat. And if they are clarifying questions, that provides the speaker and I to keep track of those and catch them when they come up. If you have any specific logistical questions or challenges, please feel free to reach me at my email there. I'll also post it in the chat, or you can text me at that phone number there as well. I will list all of that information in the chat, so that way you have my contact info if you do end up experiencing any technical difficulties. I wanted to give a couple of announcements of some exciting upcoming Guild events and partner events. We're so excited on February 1st to be hosting a Northwest Eco Building Guild Education Retreat meeting. So to make these awesome monthly events happen and a success, we have an education committee that works to brainstorm ideas of topics that should be shared for all surrounding green buildings. So if you have a topic in mind, whether it's solar or heat pumps, or maybe it's stormwater mitigation, or perhaps it's townhomes or multifamily retrofits, whatever green building topic you'd like for us to take a deep dive into and host an education session on, please feel free to attend our February 1st retreat meeting, and I will post a link to sign up for that as well in the chat. On February 23rd, we'll have our February education event, all about embodied carbon calculation tools. So if you are a builder interested in learning how to make use of those carbon calculation tools now required for some green home certification programs, you can come and learn about the EC3 tool and the BEAM carbon calculating tool. So that'll be really neat. And then, of course, our Northwest Green Home Tour, our annual tour applications are now open. You can find applications at our Northwest Green Home Tour website, as well as direct access to that website via the Northwest Eco Building Guild website, which is listed there on the slide. And I will also post that in the chat. Another fun thing, if you can't make it to our education committee retreat meeting, where we are going to kind of map out the education topics for this year, you can also vote, put in your ideas for education topics at our website. It's right there at the top corner here. It's the blue button. You can click on that and it'll take you to a survey, and there you can fill out that survey form and provide us some feedback on which events or topics you'd like us to cover. So please feel free to get involved in that process. And then I just wanted to plug, please consider becoming a Northwest Eco Building Guild member. the Guild is such a wonderful organization. We are a nonprofit, education focused for green building and green landscaping, design and architecture strategies, as well as building strategies. We are a information center and hub for the green building of our region. If you become a member, you will get access to member-only content, including past recordings of events, webinars, workshops, tour replays. So all of our Northwest Green Home Tour sites were recorded and placed online in our kind of labyrinth of information there found in our member-only pages. And also discussion forums. So if you have a burning question about a green building or green landscaping topic you want to ask other professionals about, we are going to be providing forums. Also discounted pricing on all events. We also are further developing out our code innovations database. You'll be featured on our green pages listing. And of course, it's fantastic networking opportunities to connect with like-minded green building and green architecture folks here in the region. I'd like to highlight our sponsor for this evening before introducing our speakers. I want to thank wholeheartedly for a big thank you to Pathway Design and Construction. They are a Seattle-based full-service remodeling company that specializes in highly aesthetic, eco-friendly, and custom designs. By focusing on comfort solutions to accommodate homeowners' individuality, the Pathway team is able to create beautiful and functional designs that are built to last. Paul Kocharhook is owner of Pathway and understands the repercussions of using chemical-based materials in construction and its effects on our health and the built environment. Many homeowners are unaware of the harmful effects certain building materials can have on the home's occupants. This is why Pathway has strong values around this topic, and it is their mission to promote wellness into each remodel project. It is their standard to consciously select clean, eco-friendly materials for each project while having protocols in place to leave each remodel healthier and more energy efficient. Pathway takes pride in serving the discerning homeowners of Seattle and the East Side to create beautiful remodels that are healthy, eco-friendly, and accessible to all, regardless of age, ability, or stage of life. The demand for Pathway's care and craftsmanship has been extraordinary for the past few years, doubling them in size. Their growth has created opportunities in expanding a collaborative team. If you're interested also in joining the Pathway team, you can contact them directly through their website and careers page. Thank you so much, Pathway, for sponsoring tonight's event. We're excited to have you, and they are a fabulous remodeling and building company here in Seattle. And this brings me to our kind of next our next slide, which is a list of our speakers tonight. I want to thank all of you. We've got a chock full of great speakers for tonight's event, and it's a full list, and I don't think we've had this many speakers for a while for an Eco Building Guild event. So we are just so grateful and thankful for each of you to join us tonight. So I'd like to just give a warm welcome to Stephen Hannon with A&R Solar. Stephen tonight will be covering stormwater management and engineering. Stephen Hannon is a civil and environmental engineer from the University of Delaware. His research included solar energy design and hydrogen fuel cell feasibility study for wastewater treatment effluent. Steve's professional career as a sustainable environmental engineer has allowed him to wear many hats, which fits his personality. His projects range from most recently solar energy and battery backup solutions to renewable energy assessments and energy efficiency audits for Native communities. Tonight he'll include some wonderful case studies and information surrounding the wildlife and salmon habitat design and construction. Some of his keystone projects include on the Puyallup River, Yakima River, Bear Creek and Redmond, the City of Seattle Seawall Project, and rainwater design and walking the talk by making his own house a sustainable project on a budget. So we're so excited to have Stephen to speak today on stormwater management. Our next speaker will be Huda Sheikh. She will be discussing carbon storage and landscape design. Huda is the owner and lead designer for Lotus Landscapes and Arboriculture. And I apologize. Amanda will go after Stephen. And Amanda Monte is a freelance writer and a former wildland firefighter and the host and producer of Life with Fire podcast. Welcome, Amanda. We are so excited to have you tonight. The Life and Fire podcast, we welcome you to check out. It explores how humans interact with wildfire and how we can create a more fire resilient society. And our last speaker tonight is Jason Jorgensen. Welcome, Jason. We're excited to have you. Jason will be discussing dynamic drought-tolerant gardening in the Pacific Northwest, the history, background, selected plants, and genre of plants appropriate for this use. Jason is the owner of Third Spring Landscape Design, which is a full landscape design company based here in Seattle, Washington. We are so excited to have you all. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing your presentations. And with that, I will open it up with Stephen to share with us his presentation. So I have stopped sharing my screen, Stephen, so you should be able to, take it over. Thanks.
Can you see my screen?
I can, it looks great, thanks.
All right. So just making this full screen. Okay, my name is Stephen Hannon. I work at A&R Solar. This is our owners, Andy and Reeves. As I said, that's what I've been most recently doing is solar energy and battery backup projects all over the Washington area. I'm a civil and environmental engineer. I went to the University of Delaware. I have my email here if you guys need to reach out for any of your projects. And there's a $500 Northwest Eco Build Guild referral. So you save $500 and the guild will actually get $500 if you go solar. So that's a win-win. So first we're going to talk about the City of Seattle Seawall project. So who's been there since this has been built? Feel free to put that in the chat. If you have, it doesn't look very, like you don't see much from the street. You have the lanes of traffic, you have some of these planter boxes, you have a sidewalk that has some glass in it and a handrail. That's all you really see. But below here, oh, excuse me, you can see there's a lot more going on. There's jet grouting that stabilized this soil. On top of that was a concrete slab. These cantilevered concrete formed as precast and formed between them. This seawall here was brought in as precast, one per truck. Each of these units are one per truck, and this is over a few miles that we had to bring these in. So it took a few years to do this, and then this end cap was built, and that connects to all the piers like the ferry terminal, the aquarium, etc. Down here you have habitat shelves, they're called. And that's where like seals can go at different high and low tides. There's a habitat mattress on the bottom that actually creates some, they call it a fish superhighway. And the fact there's light here now, this used to be like a dead zone where fish wouldn't go. So this is to create some areas for fish that are coming and going to the major rivers that we'll talk about later, have an area to grow and hide in here before they're eaten by other things. So here's a picture of in construction. So this is where they have the actual seawall built, and they're going to be bringing in the cantilever sections here. So this is temporarily stabilized. This is the sheet pile wall, and all this had to be pumped out because it's below the high tide line. And there's water coming down the slope as groundwater, and they actually had a freeze wall here. So they froze the soil so water could not go, it had to go around this project. So pretty amazing engineering stuff here. Down here, you're seeing they're hoisting from a crane the face of the seawall. And they'd already done the jet grouting down here. The jet grouting is where they drill down between 50 and 100 feet to hit what's called the Q layer, which is basically hard pan. So that they drill in there a foot and they back it out with grout. Grout's essentially what's in concrete without the aggregate. And it's mixing it with the soil to create these columns in a square shape to stabilize the soil. As you may know, this was all infill for the regrade, literally put fire hose at the top of the hill and washed it into the sound. structurally sound. So this was to create that, make it structurally sound, and then build a concrete slab on top of it. So I did all the inspections from environmental to make sure there was no turbidity readings that were too high, pH readings, as well as all the inspections of all this concrete, the habitat shelves, etc. So this is what it looks like after it was built. You can see the water line, that's the mean tide, low tide, high tide up here. And you can see the light coming down here. And these are the piers where the different stores are down there. And these are habitat mattresses along here. They're just filled with rock so fish can get in there. My next project is the Shodax construction oversight project. I didn't do really the design, only a minor revision, but I came in right as it was being constructed, which was awesome. This is on the Puyallup River here. This is a river that's been leveed or diked, they call it, by the Army Corps. It's actually below the flood line by about a foot. You're supposed to have 3 feet of storage above the highest flow. It's about 2 feet, so there's potential flooding in all these places. And you see there's houses back here, so don't buy in a floodplain. So what we did here is we put a 10-foot pipe through there. It brings water in at the height of the river. You can see this is a low flow river because it can actually fill up this levee. This levee was built to the same height as the existing levee. These trees here were an existing wetland that we kept intact, and then we built a ring levee around this to create a habitat where fish can go, because they're coming down here like a sluice gate, coming in hot, because it's a trapezoidal channel. There's no meanders. It's high velocity. It's nowhere really for fish to stop and chill out. So they can come in here. There's over 100 pieces of LWD, which is what's called, which is this. Do you know what LWD is? Answer in the chat. It's basically just trees, but it stands for large woody debris. And on the fly here, you can see there are some trees here, this stand of trees, and this back end here. I actually adjusted the channel design on the fly to come through here and to bump this out to save about 15 trees. It didn't seem really reasonable to take them out when we need them for shading. And we had to remove a lot of trees in order to build the levee, which we've reused. You can see the stockpile here. So I actually literally was talking to this guy, like where these need to go, how they need to be angled to best create habitat. Next up is the Yakima River. So this used to be a gravel pit, kind of like one of these over here. You dig down low enough, it's going to hit groundwater. So this was a trapezoidal pond. But now you can see these little fingers coming in. You can see these channels that were dug in all the way up here to bring in cold, fresh water. Salmon have a hard time in hotter water, so by bringing colder water in, they don't die. So that's bringing in fresher water. It's creating a current through here. We also dug deeper and shallower, so there's actually highs and lows here as opposed to just one flat channel. At the very bottom here, it ties in to, this is an off channel here. So this is all braided streams back here. So it ties in down here. The main stem of the Yakima River is here, but when it floods, there's a normal river here, but it floods, this is all underwater. These channels up here is a dispersion trench for the waste plant is right here. So the wastewater goes into the river directly. Well, now that's the backup, and plan A is going through this trench and getting dispersed into here, and then losing their heat and mixing before actually getting the main stem, down below here, south of here. This is just a picture in construction, not very scenic, but this has all been planted with native species thereafter. This used to be a carp pond, and you can imagine carp are something you want to get rid of. They're very toxic and an invasive species. They literally hold PCBs, so we had to remove those by the truckload and allow it, because they'll kill salmon. So that defeats the purpose of the salmon funding. You have to make sure they're protected, getting federal funding for that. Next up, this is Bear Creek in Redmond, Washington. The creek is here, takes a hard 90 down here and runs down here to about here. So this aerial photo is in construction. You can see some of these channels here. And over here, this is still the orchard. It hasn't been graded yet. So I did two parts of this design. I helped design this. It was modeled for the floodplain, and we basically dug channels in at various spots here below the high stream height. So basically a foot or two below the highest flood, it would overtop and go into this field to a wetland habitat with large woody debris. There's weirs along the channel. So there's like weirs along here to slow it down and create ponds, which is good for having different velocities in the creek. We also did a large woody debris. We put over 100 and some pieces of wood in here. And this is, there's already a lot of wood, so we're supplementing it. So a really cool project. You're coming down Avondale Road. You can just see it to your right. There's Microsoft some here. There's a bunch of big commercial buildings here, and this is just in their backyard. This greenway here. So really cool project. A lot of wetland space. So next up is my sustainable home, calling it the Hannon Sustainable Home on a Budget. I just remodeled my house. I'm currently in it. It's not completely moved into yet. But what we did was we tried to be as sustainable as possible. We couldn't do everything. Like we got sustainable cabinets in terms of wood, but we didn't go for the highest quality cabinet. That's one area that we had to kind of cut back on, but we had kind of the tier 2 there. So what we had is, this is not a picture of my house, but we do have a 600-gallon rainwater harvesting cistern. It takes about an inch of rain to fill it, so not very much. The way it has to be designed in Seattle, it has to overflow in the summer and then go to a dispersion trench. They did this as the Rainwise program because they found areas that were sandy soil and that they could infiltrate and start getting off the sewer, because it's time of filtration to be longer and not getting the asphalt right into the sewer lines and right to the sound. It's really trying to remove and disperse that and delay the time that it will actually get into the system. This, for the most part, 600 gallons holds our garden for the year. Getting a mid-summer rain will refill it, but for the most part, we can grow a lot of food, tomatoes, peppers, etc., off this. We did a heat pump ductless system. We have 2 condensers with 6 heads throughout the house. We actually reused 3 of them from my old remodel house and added 3 more with a hyperheat setting, which allows us to get lower temperatures. Went with a a heat pump water heater. The 80-gallon one, in my research, I was debating just doing a standard water heater. And I went with the heat pump because it actually acts more like an on-demand. Instead of being 80 gallons, it's continuously heating. So you actually get more like a few hundred gallons of relative hot water. And therefore, I didn't need 2 water heaters, one for our rental unit, mother-in-law, and our house. So it saved space in our garage, which was pretty critical. And it's also a few $100s cheaper a year to run. The cost of it is about $1,200 versus $700 or $800 for the water heater. But if I had to get the smaller water heater for the ADU, it was about the same price, the 2 of them versus the 1. And the life cycle is almost double on these. So that's really where you get your savings, is the long-term investment. Moving on to some of the products we use, we did Safe Coat. This is a no VOC caulk. They also have an adhesive we used. We did low VOC paint. We didn't do no. It was our paint supplier. He only wanted to use low VOC, but that's for another story. We actually have an ERV system, so that brings in fresh air from the outside and pulls out the stale air. This is a lot better than just having a house vent because that's just pulling from inside the house. This is exchanging the air and actually doing a recovery system, so you're not losing all that energy. And over here, we had marmoleum floors in our 3 bathrooms. In our mud room, so right when we come into the house to take off our boots from skiing and hiking, etc., it's easy to clean. It's sustainable. And marmoleum is made basically from products that could be eaten. And then we have radiant heat there. So it kind of gives us a baseline heat in those rooms. And we don't actually have a heater outside of that in those rooms. Really easy to maintain, really easy to install, and using that Safe Coat adhesive made it pretty sustainable overall. We used Energy Star appliances. We used FSC wood in our walls. I was pretty glad that we could get that from a standard lumber yard. We didn't have to actually get that specially imported, and there was a wood shortage during part of this construction. For the majority of the floors in the downstairs, the stairway, and the upstairs hallway, we went with a sustainable Valenge flooring. This is from Green Home Solutions. All the flooring was from there. We also used the green pine beetle kill. So this wood was killed by beetles. And then somebody really smart decided to use that wood as opposed to using, virgin forests. And it has this really cool green hue. So we have green tile in the kitchen and green lights, blown glass lights. So this all kind of comes together, and it's a really beautiful color and really nice end grain design. So that's really cool. And then the upstairs, we went with just a standard click cork floor. Really nice on the feet. I've been really impressed with it. It's very durable. So this is all in all the bedrooms. This is not our baby room, but we do have a baby now, 10 months old. He's pretty awesome. Now onto the solar design. So this is 100% custom to Steve Hannon. I came up with this design. It is not standard. I did a checkerboard here. Usually it's either all these all black or all these tuxedo. My design team and my crew are not super happy because usually you just link the solar panels like daisy chaining in them. Well, when you have different outputs for each one of these, you can't do that. So this becomes a lot harder to install. But I wanted to be the first person to ever do this. So they made it happen. So these tuxedo ones are 400 watts each. They're 60 cell, 6x10. The all black are 385. So we're talking 15 watts more per panel. Not a huge difference, but the aesthetics, some people really want this aesthetics. All black, it's really sleek. But a lot of people like the tuxedo. I have people doing both of those. So they work really well. A lot of architects and HOAs like the all black require all black in HOAs. If you don't have a roof that's seen from the street, some people are like, I don't care what it looks like. If it's a really flat roof or a membrane roof that you won't be able to see, then you can really open up your options if you don't care about aesthetics. How am I doing on time, Nina?
You have about 5 minutes left.
Wow, that went quick. I must be talking really fast. So I just wanted to go through some numbers of solar. A lot of people say solar is expensive, and I hear that. But the way you have to, if you're talking to somebody, if you're an architect or a builder, and they're like, "Oh, I'm thinking about solar," or you could open up the question is, "Have you thought about solar?" You should talk to Steve Hannon, Solar Steve over at A&R. So what the thing is, if you're paying $100 in an energy bill, and you have a $120 loan for a solar design, you're just shifting those funds and really paying $20 out of pocket, while getting, in this case, this is a $30,000 system, a 10 kilowatt system. This is new construction and they have a battery backup. So this price is actually higher than a standard solar system because the battery is paired with this inverter. A standard inverter is going to be a few $1,000s less than this. So just know this is slightly higher, but it gets you in the ballpark. This person had a discount because they had a referral and we were giving an end of year sale. So that's a little more than normal. There's zero sales tax. That's sweet. That got removed 2 years by Olympia and our governor. Your tax credit's 26% of your system. Your energy savings over 10 years is $12,000. So you start out at 36, and after 10 years, you're at 14, so 22,000 less. That's a really good return on investment. But the thing is, if you sold your house in that time, you have a home value increase, and we use 50% less than the Berkeley Laboratory study said. They found $4 a watt. We do. Zillow did a study to determine what home value increases, and they just said 5% on a home. And our customers are a third source of data. They said their house sold faster than their other house in the cul-de-sac for more money, same exact design. They had solar and battery. The battery storage side of this, which I did at my house, is really what I call the future home, because if the grid goes down for 6 months for an earthquake in April, September, I'm set. I can even charge my car because I'm going to be producing so much. The entire house, everything, because I'm all electric, 100% solar electric, um, which took a lot of work, a lot of energy efficiency, a lot of, smart decisions about windows, working with my builder, working with my architect to actually put the windows in the right locations, not many north facing windows, increasing the R value, etc. So it can be done. Not every house, if you got like a 4,000 square foot house, probably can't do it. But if it has some gas things, which we don't promote gas, but your electric use will be lower. The thing to think about is this person, if they didn't go solar, is going to pay $60,000 over 25 years. So their system will pay off by $23,000 in 25 years, paid off plus 23,000 net, which is pretty amazing. And their cost per watt is $12.99, 12 cents and 99. City of Seattle price is 13 cents. So you would be buying energy for 30 years cheaper than you're currently paying. And we all know energy prices only rise about 3 times over 30 years. Here's some of our other cool projects. This is the Powerwall triple one. This is in a garage where they actually have it, which isn't the most energy efficient, but I'm not going to argue. It's for this house in Bainbridge. They can see the city. You can't even see the solar panels here. You can with a little aerial. We've done some really cool projects like IKEA, the first Washington solar car dealership, and Audi. We do ground mounts. We do low income housing. We do commercial. We do residential. I focus on residential, but we have a whole team dedicated to both of them. So it's a really awesome place to work. They really treat their employees well. We have good benefits. We care about our employees. We give a living wage because if you want to retain your employees, you need to treat them well. And it's part of our motto to be quality, craftsmanship, and balance, a work-life balance, which they have exhibited over and over and time again, the importance of that. And I've literally had to use that. Since we got a minute or two, I talk about energy efficiency. I did this in my last presentation. This is the easy way or the free way to save money. Ghost loads using a kilowatt meter. You have your phone, your computer cord plugged in at a computer. It's going to draw part of the day. Your microwave clock, do you need that on, or just your oven one? These are things that draw 2 to 10 watts of energy all the time, 24 hours a day, 365. Put it on a surge protector. You use your energy. You set your thermostat at 70, 80, or do you set it at 67? My heat pumps, it's crazy. I can set them at like 65 or 66 and it feels like 70. It's just phenomenal. So use your lower thermostat settings, throw on a sweater, don't have your AC turned on, open the windows and use a fan. We also have fans as well as the heat pump, so we don't have to use it for AC. These socket sealers are a great way to seal your sockets. It's quieter. You're not getting as much draft. And they're like $2. So you could do your whole house in like under $10. Yeah, we went over that. Oh, this is where I did some energy efficiency in Alaska at the school. So we focused on how to make things efficient because the cost of energy is 5 times are here because they're literally burning 50-gallon drums in giant engines. Like think of like 2 or 3 tractor trailer engines with 55-gallon drums getting shipped up there. Not the most efficient way to do things. So if we have any more time, we can open up the questions or we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys being here and having me as a speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. I think what we'll go ahead and do is go into Amanda's presentation, and right after Amanda's presentation, we'll break for questions. Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate it. So I think if Amanda is on, you should have access to share your screen as soon as Stephen stops shares. You should be able to share your presentation. Thank you, Stephen. That was awesome. Hi, Amanda.
Hi guys. All right. Awesome. Let's get into it here. Yep, here we go. All right. Awesome. Well, to start out, just a quick introduction. I know they had one for me earlier, but yeah, I'm Amanda Monti. I'm a freelance writer. I live up in Bellingham. And it's kind of funny doing a presentation about preparing for wildfires and home hardening because I don't own a home. And so a lot of this language and a lot of like the nitty gritty stuff, I'm like, oh, actually, like, I don't know if this actually kind of applies. And especially in the Northwest, things are a little different. A lot of this information comes from places like California and Southern Oregon, Arizona, that are a little more sort of fire prone. But we'll get into that. For now, you know, this is like a really good example of kind of what I'm going to be touching on. You know, this home being somehow miraculously saved. Probably a big part of this was firefighting efforts, but also you can kind of see the basic tenets of what I'm going to talk about. They've cleared out a lot of the conifers from directly next to their home. They have kind of almost a fuel. It looks like they might have cleared all the way out to this area, which might have, you know, contributed a little bit to successful firefighting efforts. But yeah, so the biggest question here, I think a lot of people will probably have is, you know, we live in a really wet area. We live in the in the Cascades, the west side of the Cascades. And so it's really easy to not really think about fire as being, you know, a prevalent thing in this area. It's really easy to just say like, you know, think that you don't need to be necessarily worried about it. But I think with the Cascades, it's considered a high severity, low frequency fire regime. So you're looking at fires that might only happen every 300 years, 100 to 300 years, maybe even longer. But when those fires do burn, because of how wet it is here, we have really big fuel loads. So we have a lot of dead and down trees. We have a lot of sort of what we call ladder fuels that are growing up, and they're contributing to fire moving from the ground and easily into the tops of trees, which increases fire severity. So when we do have these big fires come through, they are very destructive. And a lot of the time, because we aren't necessarily prepared for these fires, because we live in such a wet area, it can contribute to a lot of home loss, a lot of property destruction, and a lot of tragedy, really. I think a really good example of this that a lot of people probably have in the forefront of their minds is the so-called Labor Day firestorm of 2020. That was a really tragic reminder of just how these landscapes are still fire prone. Even if they don't burn very often, they are fire prone, and that they are part of these ecosystems. And so it's better to just kind of be prepared and kind of think ahead of things and have these things in mind when you are building your home and renovating your home and landscaping and thinking up Saturday projects, just to have this sort of fire adapted mindset going through all of those processes. So, you know, it's going to require adapting ourselves to fire and to the future of fire, especially. I think an important thing to note is that, especially with the Labor Day firestorm, it was a little bit of a fluke in terms of there were already a lot of fires on the ground, and then we had this huge east wind event, which is fairly rare for this area, and it resulted in really fast fire spread, really intense fire spread in areas that aren't necessarily fitted or aren't necessarily adapted to those events. And so as we have more of these really, climate change exacerbating droughts, and we have more of these extreme weather events caused by climate change, it's going to kind of influence these events. It could contribute to more of these events in the future on a shortening time scale. So whereas maybe these ecosystems haven't burned or didn't normally burn for 150 to 400 years in places, we could be seeing some shortening timescales for that as climate change kind of drives that. So, so preparing for these things, considering these things as you renovate, as you build, as you landscape is really critical. Another big part of this, of course, it's not just the homeowner's responsibility, although that is very important. It's also, what's going on? There we go. It's also a huge priority to get your community involved. I think probably a recent, well, let me see where I'm at here. Getting your community involved, getting involved in your community, whether you have maybe you have a fire adapted network. Washington State has a fire adapted network, and they work within communities to build that fire resilience, to develop fuel breaks, to work with cooperators like tribes, state agencies, federal agencies to build these fuel breaks around communities, which really contributes to lessening fire spread, bringing down that fire intensity, and improving firefighters' ability to, be on the ground and actually suppressing those fires versus kind of, if you have a really intense fire on the ground, sometimes you just have to back away and you can't really engage because it's too intense. So putting in those fuel breaks is it's an important priority on top of actually having your homes hardened to wildfire. So really the idea is, home hardening is the essence of it is really just building a greater relationship with the landscapes that you love and that you live in. And so, these ecosystems really have adapted with fire, even though it's very infrequent. So really for the purpose of this presentation, I think that means being really attuned to those natural processes and making our properties reflect the presence of those processes and the precedent, I guess, that a lot of these areas have for these fires. So kind of the main elements here are native plants, well-spaced trees, and then naturally fire-resistant materials when you're building your home. We'll get into all of that. Those all kind of build that natural resilience to the landscape. So like I said, it's going to be this is a coordinated effort. And I really encourage you all to go out into your communities or even maybe talk to your HOA or talk to your neighbors about this kind of thing, because it is really critical. I think a good example recently of a fire that made this kind of more of a public understanding was the Marshall Fire in Colorado back in early January. That fire was effectively, after it kind of went through the brush and the grass nearby, that fire ultimately became effectively fueled by homes. So you have homes that are really close to each other, and that ends up being the main fuel source for fires like this. And there have been other examples of that in California. Paradise was a good example. So really talking to your neighbors is an important step in hardening your own home and making sure that, yeah, your home may not be super fire prone, but if your neighbor's home, if your neighbor has overhanging brush on their roof, or they have a bunch of shrubs right next to their home, or they haven't really cleared out a lot of the undergrowth in their land, that could contribute to less sort of safety overall for the neighborhood and for you and for your property as well. So as far as the community thing goes, I'll get into the home specific stuff in a minute, but fuel breaks around communities are an invaluable resilience measure. This can take the form of, I know in Bend, Oregon, I think that they've done greenbelt recreation areas kind of on the outskirts of town. And then they've also done thinned and burned units kind of literally encompassing the town so that it's more or less protected. And they're doing that on a sort of 10-year basis. They'll do one unit this year and then another unit next to it the next year. And then they'll kind of just circle back to the other unit within 5-6 years to make sure that all stays as fire adapted as possible. But these fuel breaks can look like I said, recreation areas, green belts, agricultural land, or these thinned and burned units, which are usually the responsibility of state departments like Washington DNR or federal agencies, the Forest Service, BLM. Sometimes tribes are involved in that kind of thing. And in many places, and this is building, this is a movement that's building across the West. Private landowners are starting to burn their own land as well, while collaborating with local prescribed fire associations. And I will link to a few of those organizations and those resources at the end. So this is kind of grainy, don't mind that, but this is kind of the essence of what I'm talking about. So you have your general community protection, you have this fuel break here. And then each individual homeowner should be responsible for defensible space. This is something that's growing more in California to be based in policy. They're kind of requiring homeowners to do these kinds of things. It's less so in Washington, especially on the west side of the Cascades, but something, like I said, something to consider. And I think it's only going to grow more relevant in the coming years. So another element is access. You want to be able to, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but especially in your own property, being able to get large fire apparatus into your property, whether that's engines, these things weigh a lot. So those, like little bridges, sometimes if you have like a little bridge that's doesn't have a ton of weight capacity, that could be a limiting factor to getting access to your property. And then also just evac routes, considering those evac routes and maybe talking with your neighbors, I don't know, talking to your community, and making sure that those evac routes are very clear before you need them. So honing it into the homeowner responsibility. This is a really good example or a really good visual of kind of what we're looking at for what a fire adapted or like a fire resilient home might look like. So within 5 feet of the house, you're looking at this sort of this perimeter here. You're not going to have any, it's preferable that you don't have any shrubs or any trees that are like directly abutting the house. It's also good to not have any limbs that are directly over the house. The main point, the main objective here is that if you have ember fall from a fire that's maybe 2 miles away, it can be up to 3 miles away. Like these fires can throw embers for a long ways out. So you're looking for anything that could potentially be a home for a falling ember, and you want to make sure that that doesn't have the opportunity to spread, nor ignite your home or surrounding property. So, so that 30-foot perimeter here, that's where you're going to kind of be really conscious of any dead and down trees, any underbrush, kind of really conscious of what species of trees that you have there, what species of plants, and we'll get into what kind of species to look for. But essentially, you're really trying to keep that space pretty clear with maybe a few interspersed trees, preferably not conifers if possible, but if they're spaced enough and if they're native, then it's okay. Also would recommend not having mulch directly abutting your house, maybe using rock or gravel in landscaping near the house is preferable. One of the questions that I got initially when I was setting up this presentation was, where would I keep a lawnmower? Where should I keep a lawnmower? And I would recommend that shed, 30, 40 feet from the house. Keep any like noxious chemicals there, any lawnmowers, anything that have the potential to explode and to potentially ignite your home. I would also recommend, when we walk up to a house and we do what's called like a structure assessment, to determine if, for example, if a fire is 2 miles away, we're going to go in and we're going to look at structures and see kind of what we're working with. If we have log piles directly under decks, or if we have propane tanks 5 feet from the house, those are things that are huge hazards to firefighters on the ground. So those are things we wouldn't necessarily write off your house by any means, but we're going to take note and we're going to say, like, we need to, if this thing is right here, then we can't be near that propane tank. It's good to keep propane tanks as far away as possible. And then, your wood pile, of course, keeping that as far away as possible within that beyond that 30-foot buffer would be preferable. And then within that 100-foot buffer, you're still looking at really kind of sparse vegetation if possible, keeping things kind of limbed up. I would suggest limbing trees up to about 6-7 feet so that any ground fire, isn't going to be able to climb into the crowns of the trees in your yard and then thus potentially throw embers onto your home. Another thing, of course, is keeping your roof clean. Any debris on your roof or any debris in your gutters could potentially also house an ember and then, of course, ignite. And we'll get into that, but roofing material is also important here. A lot of houses, like on the east side and in Winthrop and in the Methow Valley, I've gone over there and I've seen almost every house has a tin roof or has an aluminum roof, whatever the material is, but a metal roof nonetheless. So I think that's a good indication. And maybe not as necessary on the west side, but something to think about. And especially if you live kind of up out of city limits and kind of up in the mountains a bit. So this is a ponderosa pine forest. So this isn't super relevant to what we're talking about, but just as an example of kind of what a good vegetation should kind of look like generally. So for those maybe that are on the crest or maybe on the east side of the Cascades, I don't know if many of you are, but this is kind of what like a well like thinned, a well managed forest looks like on the right side here. So this guy here, and then this one you can kind of tell, you have limbs all the way to the ground. If you have ground fire, it would be really easy for it to climb. Whereas over here you have very little fuel on the ground. You have trees that are limbed up, have been pruned. And generally it would allow for the fire to sort of creep along the ground and not get into the crowns of the trees, which is when fire gets the most intense. Another visual kind of what I'm talking about here. So really just dialing in your vegetation and making sure that it's not super thick, making sure that it's kind of just well maintained, and that you're pruning trees and getting the limbs off of your roof, and kind of not letting anything really abut the house. So as for actual home hardening strategies, as I was saying, roofs that are metal, clay, tile, anything really other than, you know, wooden shingle roofs, that's a little bit more fire adapted or fire resilient than the standard, I guess, wooden shingle. Like I said, removing debris from roofs and gutters, pretty helpful. Covering vent openings is also a really useful strategy. Fine metal mesh just to prevent embers from getting into the house that way. And this is a little more specific, but, you know, dual paned windows with one pane of tempered glass. Sorry again for the death by slideshow here. But yeah, the dual pane glass, just because they have potential to break, and then you of course have the and that's like, you know, that can happen when the fire is not even really that close. You know, you just have that. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, you have a little bit of heat and your windows can break. So just having some sort of glass that is prepared for that, or thinking about that when you're building and you're buying windows. As for siding, you know, stucco, cement, treated wood, those other sorts of approved materials. You know, this is all getting a little specific. This is all like kind of more like heavily fire prone areas, but again, just something to consider, something to think about. And if you have a vacation home on the east side or something like that, then definitely something to worry about. But not really sure how prevalent or how like absolutely necessary this is in our area, but kind of the more necessary stuff, we'll get into this, is landscaping, and that's kind of why I'm here. So really just kind of using fire resistant materials as much as possible. Stone walls, you know, rock retaining walls, those are really helpful. Basically any sort of pathway, stone pathway, that's like a kind of a great little fire break for ground fire. So making sure that you have those kinds of materials kind of interspersed, and you know, using rock and mulch when it's a little bit further away from the house, as well as flower beds and garden as sort of ground cover, is pretty handy. Like I said, not really having a lot of those shrubs and larger trees really close to the house. On that note, there are no real like fireproof plants, but you're just kind of looking for high moisture plants. So deciduous trees especially are very much in that realm. And then anything with like a low sap or resin content. Like I said, gravel and decorative rock are pretty useful close to the house. Mulch is definitely not recommended there. So here's a good little quick example. Not really the Northwest, I don't think, but here it is. So fireproof plants or fire resistant plants, you guys can read these, but here are a few options. You know, you don't want the junipers, the rosemary, grass, like big grasses right next to the house. As always, you're kind of looking for more low ground cover, high moisture content, things like that. And I don't know if you guys want to take a screenshot of this too, you can feel free to do that. As for trees, as I was saying, kind of deciduous, you're kind of in that deciduous realm in terms of what's going to be highest moisture content, what's going to kind of hold moisture through the summer. So yeah, maple, poplar, cherry trees, madrone and ash trees, always helpful, especially if they're well spaced. That's really the biggest point here, is just to space them out well. Pine, fir, incense, cedar, manzanita, and live oak, definitely not recommended, really close to the house anyway. And some things to consider, I think in the Northwest especially, smoke is going to be more of a persistent problem than actual wildfires. So considering getting a high quality air filter or air purifier is definitely something you should be thinking about right now, especially with the coming summer, and especially with, it looks like we're going to get a pretty dry February. I was just saw something from a meteorologist on Twitter. Looks like it's going to be a dry February. So if we have kind of a persistent drought through the winter or through the spring, then we could be dealing with a lot of wildfire smoke this summer. So that's something that we can do kind of like tomorrow, is kind of dial in our purification system and our filtration system so that we're not sucking smoke all summer. And as I was mentioning earlier, making sure that there's easy access to your property is critical, so that fire engines, bulldozers, and really kind of heavy machinery can get up there. So really the only limitation here I would say is maybe, clearing out the brush on your road in up to maybe 8-10 feet. And then any of those like small bridges with a low weight capacity, maybe consider replacing those or getting something with a higher weight capacity so that people can get in there if they need to. I mentioned this earlier as well, but evacuation routes are really important to think about because some towns in the mountains really only have one way in and out, and some communities really only have one way in and out. So neighborhoods, communities. So really thinking about those things ahead of time, and then just maybe talking to your community to like really hone in an evacuation plan. I think Paradise really made that clear that that's important. Paradise, California, the campfire, they only had really one way in and out. And so when that road gets backed up, if there's not other options available, or if there's not pullouts that, provide something of a safety zone in the event of a fire, those things can be a real bottleneck and a real problem. So not something that you necessarily can do, but these are all things that you can also bring to your HOA, bring to your community, to your, community board of whatever, but those are things that you can bring up and, talk to your neighbors about. So another random consideration, but that I came up on the internet and I was like, hey, that's not a bad idea, is to have a backup battery for your garage door. And this is probably relevant for anything, any natural disaster that we could potentially see in the Northwest, but especially for wildfires, you want to be able to get your garage door open if you need to, get out quick. So key takeaways here. The main goal really is to prevent any opportunities for falling embers to ignite or spread to your home. So that's really the big picture kind of thought to have, mindset to have when you're planning these projects or when you're renovating or when you're building homes. And as I've said throughout this, this really is a community thing. It's really a full community's responsibility. And sometimes, communities aren't thinking about this, or maybe they haven't developed a plan for this. So bringing that up at community meetings, bringing it up to the people in your community that are in positions of power. This is really something that people should be thinking about, even if we don't get a ton of fire. As I mentioned, it's kind of only a matter of time before, we have some crazy wind event, or we have a really bad drought and we get a lightning strike or a lightning bust. These things can happen, and it's very, very feasible that they will happen soon. So it's worth kind of talking to people in your community about it and starting to get a plan into place, and maybe talk about fire adaptation strategies for the community as a whole. Maybe some education opportunities, talking to people about what I'm talking about right now, and just kind of getting the word out. Kind of in general, hardening your home is more critical than what you put in your yard. But it's still very important to think about what kind of vegetation you have and how spaced out that vegetation is. That's really the biggest point that I'd like to make, is just simply not having tons of vegetation within that 30-foot buffer of your house. And then from there on out, really going out and clearing out any trees that are going to be, that are like really tightly spaced, or maybe are overgrown, or, just kind of gnarly. And maybe you have some dead and down trees. Maybe you have some low brush, like maybe go out and spend a Saturday using the chainsaw. I don't know. I love using my chainsaw, any opportunity that I have. Another example of a fire adapted home that somehow managed to escape unscathed in this situation. I'm looking at like the rock barrier. I'm seeing very little, obviously it was all burned, but I'm seeing very little vegetation directly near the home. And I think I see like a little pathway underneath the deck. Another important thing to note is just not having log piles or kind of debris under your deck, and maybe considering a more fire resistant material for your deck as well. So yeah. These are some resources I can throw into I'll throw them into the chat actually after this is done, but you can look up your local prescribed burning association. There's a couple that have popped up across Washington state. And like I mentioned earlier, the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Network is a super valuable resource. Like just go like poke around on their website for a little bit and you'll learn a ton. I'll put this fire resistant plants PDF in the chat as well. And Firewise USA is a really cool resource that just talks about, or that just has a map that shows Firewise communities that have sort of gotten that like stamp of approval for having already had those discussions and having already put in some sort of plan to be more fire adapted and to continue sort of progressing towards that fire resilience. So that is all I've got. I hope I didn't go too fast.
Thank you, Amanda. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. I would love it too if you could also add in the chat a link to your podcast, please. That would be wonderful for folks as well.
Awesome. I can do that right now.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So we'll pause real quick before we end, with our next, or before we continue with our next two presenters for a quick question and answer session. We'll spend about 10-15 minutes answering some questions that were brought up during Amanda and Stephen's presentation. So like I said, this is a live webinar, so please, if you are comfortable, feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, turn on your camera, and it provides an opportunity to get to interact with our speakers that we have tonight one-on-one, or you can also post questions in the chat that we can answer as well. Thanks so much.
So Wendy and Helen had a question about a clarification about my solar design that I showed. So that is just the solar portion. That's not the cost for the battery. What I was saying is the price would be different because the inverters are different for a battery system versus a just a solar only system. The price of batteries varies. The smallest system we can do is one 10 kilowatt hour battery from LG. There's also a 13.5 kilowatt hour battery for Tesla, and there's a 16 kilowatt hour battery for LG. Helen was asking how much power that gets you. If you're using 10 kilowatt hours a day, that gets you a full day with a 10 kilowatt hour battery. If you're using 20, it's 12 hours. You would need two batteries to get 24 hours, or reduce your energy, like don't run the dryer, don't charge your electric car, don't use the stove, just use a toaster oven and a microwave, or boil hot water to make like dehydrated food, etc. So that the price from the low end is 16,000, the upper end can go up to the 40s. But most people are in the 20 to 30 range, and the tax credit applies, the 26% tax credit applies to batteries as well as solar. You can do solar first and add batteries later, or combine them all at once. So we're seeing more people doing both with new construction. Just want to clarify, I saw that in the chat.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it. I have a question for Amanda. A lot of folks ask, is a detached or having the garage detached or attached have any impact on fire protection for the home? We've had some builders ask, well, what is better in maybe rural communities? Should we keep the garage detached to keep the home safer? Or what are your thoughts on detached versus attached garages for fire safety?
My only thought would be that if it's built with the same materials as the house, preferably fire resilient materials, and they have those mesh coverings on any vents, and they've sort of made the same considerations as they did when building the house, then it would be okay. The only caveat would be maybe if the homeowners are planning to store a lot of flammable anything in the garage, or anything that would have gas in it, obviously cars are different, but then I would maybe consider a detached garage, unless a shed is potentially in play. But in general, I would say from my own perspective, I would say maybe look this up. But my own perspective would be that if it were built with the same materials as the house, then it wouldn't be much more of a problem.
Thanks. Awesome. Any more questions for Stephen and Amanda before we move on to our next two speakers?
Oh, I did see the thing from Elena, it looks like. If each house in a suburb followed the 30 to 100-foot rule for fire protection, it feels like there would be little to no vegetation in the development. That's true. And that's totally, I think that's totally a different kind of ball game that might be kind of dependent more on maybe talking with your HOA or with your community members, and just kind of doing what you can. Because like I said, in those developments, you know, the most important element of that would be a fuel break of some sort around the development. Because once it kind of gets into those developments, homes really do act as fuel. And that's only, it's rare that happens, but you know, on some fires that has been presented that homes become effectively the fuel source for a fire versus the vegetation itself. So hard to say in a suburb kind of what that would look like. I think this is also like another thing where I'm not a homeowner, so I'm not like entirely sure, but I would just say maybe talking with neighbors and kind of clearing out what you can and just making it somewhat managed. Of course, you know, you still want those ecosystem benefits and you still want to have those nice parts of your yard. That's totally fine. But just clearing out any of that underbrush and sort of dead and down stuff is important.
I have a question for Amanda. May I ask it?
Yeah.
Okay, Amanda, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm building a house on a steep slope on Cougar Mountain out by Issaquah. Last summer in our heat wave, we had a 30-acre fire just not too far from there. Very interesting, very close to the city. And we're building, for our soffit vents, we're using Vulcan vents. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but those are a screen vent system. And the question is, are there lesser expensive screen systems for vents, for soffit vents that are less expensive, or are there people who've built their own, and are there studies that show that they're equally as effective?
To be honest, John, I have no clue. I am not familiar with that.
Okay.
I'm not familiar enough with vents. I know like the mesh vents. I've talked to a lot of folks about vents being very important in not allowing embers into the house. But I don't know the specifics on sort of models or types. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Vulcan vent's a common one that's used on Eastern Washington. And in fact, the closest place available to pick those up would be Cle Elum, Ellensburg lumber yards. But they're they look like a fantastic system. I think they're part of the California code as well. But I'm just sort of trying to explore if there's less expensive options that are as good. Another question is, to me, it seems obvious that Western Washington is going to have more and more fire problems as our climate change progresses. Are there currently efforts to create fire standards for people who are building on steep forested slopes or forested slopes in general in Western Washington, like there are in California and Eastern Washington?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure, but I do know, just speaking from Bellingham, I think that we're a little bit behind in that conversation, and I'm not actually familiar with building standards on the west side, really. I know that like California is just sort of catching up with that, or just kind of starting to make that more of a common thing. But I'm unfamiliar with what those building codes are in Washington State, and if there's any real policy aimed towards improving those building standards.
Okay, I think it's done.
Answer more.
I think it's done county by county, and it's really, as far as I know, there's no standards on the west side, though I could be mistaken, but there are on the east side in the real high fire areas, but it seems to be a progression to consider it. One more question for you is, we're building on a one-way road up on a steep hill, heavily forested slope. What do people do for evacuation plans on one-way roads? What do they dream up for dealing with that situation?
Yeah, I would say widening. I would say if you have the property available, or if you maybe have neighbors that were keen on it, developing almost a safety zone. So, you know, maybe there's an area that's like a meadow or something to that effect. And that's an area where maybe a couple of cars could fit. In fire, we would say it's kind of like a 200-foot swath. You know, kind of generally, like you're trying to be 200 feet away from the fire. So we would often use parking lots. We would use kind of like large pullouts on forest roads. Those happen sometimes. We would use meadows. So, you know, maybe widening the road, maybe finding those areas that you can kind of safely take cover. I would say, yeah, for those 1-lane roads, it's kind of hard. Just maybe having, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I am like I'm like prepared for this from the viewpoint of fighting fire, where like we have a ton of access because most of the time it's been evacuated, and so we don't actually see that evacuation kind of in progress. And so I haven't really heard on any of the fires that I've been on that there's been much of a problem. Usually those things come in, especially in West Side fires. I feel like, you know, those things would come in time for you to have, you know, an ample amount of time to move down the mountain to something, you know, more safe. That's my roundabout answer.
Thank you.
Stephen, did you have a question?
I just had a little bit more to add to that. Two things on the venting. The one thing about solar, it's a little bit more nuanced, is we can actually fly over vents. So if there's and they have to be 2-inch diameter, where the hood vents have to be less than 4.5 feet. There's taller ones that are 5.5 or 6.5 inches. If it's less than 5.5 inches, it can fly over a vent, and therefore it's protected by the solar panels. Metal roofs are easier to attach to solar, so bulletproof, solar's bulletproof, you're super bulletproof. And evacuation route, I heard from some of the fires in California, people just literally had their bikes. Like if the road was partially closed, they biked out of there if they couldn't get their car out of there, or they had dirt bikes. It's not ideal, but there are electric versions of these that you could charge off of solar. So that's all I had to add, was just kind of thinking about the vents, because that's one, you know, way to work or think your way out of that problem with the vents.
I loved your tie back to solar. Thanks, Stephen. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Amanda, for your time tonight and for presenting. And thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was great. That was very informative.
I appreciate both of your time. And again, this session is being recorded. So for all the information Amanda has shared in the chat, as well as in her presentation, will be available after. So have a wonderful rest of your night, Amanda. And we'll go ahead and transition to the next two speakers. Now that we've talked about fire, I'm excited to transition into a carbon storage discussion with Huda tonight. So Huda, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and start your presentation.
All right, thanks, Nina.
All right. I'm going to try that one more time. Just
Oh
one
God, I
minute.
hope it's not my electric boogie.
No, you are good. Sorry, one second. One more time. I apologize. It's a little tricky. Okay, here we go. I will minimize this, and I will start from here. Alrighty, can you see my screen okay, Huda?
I can see your screen and you can hear me, right, Nina?
Perfect. Yes, I can. Awesome. Thank you so much, Huda.
All right, well, thank you guys. And thanks, Amanda, for the discussion on fire and bringing that to the forefront today. And it's a really important subject. And I'm here to speak about carbon storage and counterbalancing the effects of climate change in the landscape. But I do want to address that Amanda was probably referring to high fire areas. And in my discussion, I am speaking about areas that are not really considered high fire. They are areas that buildings can be integrated into and into their environment with minimal disturbance. So a little bit about my job. I travel throughout Western Washington, and I design and build outdoor living spaces that are ecologically centered, yet contemporary and innovative. Next slide. My motto, be the change you see in the world. This is how my design process starts, and it seems fitting given the atmospheric river we just experienced a few weeks ago and all the climate disasters across the country. How many of you have stories relating to our extreme weather? Next slide. According to NOAA, an atmospheric river can stretch between 250 to 375 miles, flows in the direction of the air created by weather patterns, and carries excessively large amounts of water vapor in the form of rain or snow. They are common, but climate change makes them more extreme. These images were taken during the first 2 weeks of January. And next slide. And when we all thought it was over, Mother Nature decided to tell us we have a tsunami warning. With extreme shifts in weather patterns, a casualty of the war is major ecological disturbances, including forest fires, extreme flooding, and droughts. Massive biological loss and disturbances of plant and soil biomasses directly affects the Earth's natural ability to counterbalance carbon storage. Next slide. To be frank, the race is on, and it's time for us as individuals to be the examples and to be the change. Next slide. The World Resources Institute states of the world's 3 largest tropical rainforests, only the Congo has enough standing forests left to remain a strong net carbon sink. The World Bank estimates that 19 to 29% of greenhouse emissions stem from agriculture and is a major cause for climate change. Climate change has negative effects on crop yields and lowering livestock production. And according to NASA, human activities have changed Earth's natural greenhouse, and in doing so have increased atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration by 48% since the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. So what can we do? Adopt the philosophy of being a climate change warrior, starting with your outdoor living space. Through carbon positive design and building techniques, we can make a strong impact on carbon storage. My business motto, make it look like nature did it. And this starts with viewing everything through the lens of a park. Next slide. This is Tony Grinder, the former mayor of Skykomish, who contracted us to build a park in the soon-to-be new city center. It was meant as a place for locals to meet and kids to play, and it was also designed as a place to embrace their cultural history of industry. The project was funded by King County Parks and the Department of Ecology, and the budget was tight and time-stamped with use it or lose it by December 31st. We won the contract on October 17th. Next slide. One of the most challenging aspects of this design and build was that our site was located in one of Washington State's largest cleanup sites. In order to be successful and sustainable, we had to understand the past and current ecological impacts, and we had to take time to understand what our overall carbon and environmental impacts would be. This is when carbon positive design came to the forefront of all of our design and build processes. Next slide. With the hope of counterbalancing climate change, carbon positive design is the use of carbon sequestering and storage techniques for the built environment. So where do you start? The first step is mindful research through site evaluations. In urban areas, research surrounding properties and nearby forest ecosystems, and in rural areas, research natural flora and fauna. Knowing that human activity causes carbon negative byproducts, research what the most prominent ones are located in your area. Keep thinking, if I was a park. Once research is complete, you will have enough knowledge to plan and draw a base map. Zoning the map through environment and existing ecology enables more thought to planning and identifies areas where mitigation might be necessary. In your sketch, include key features of your findings and build them into the most appropriate ecological zone. These zones will help in developing your overall plant list and construction cut sheets. It also gives you a head start on calculating the amount of carbon your outdoor space will ultimately sink or source. Having the information allows you to make educated decisions, and remember, when in doubt, at least mitigate through problem solving. Next slide. A great tool to help you through this process and along the way is an app called Pathfinder, created by Pamela Conrad of Climate Positive Design. The app allows you to measure and reduce your carbon impact before and during your build. Now let's take a closer look at carbon storage and the elements that lead to carbon positive builds. Next slide. One of my favorite parts of hiking through a national park is the trees. From providing shelter for wildlife to helping maintain our streams and fisheries, trees are the cornerstone of any park and of any outdoor living space. According to the World Research Institute, the world's forests sequester twice the amount of CO2 that they emitted between 2001 to 2019. Forests provide a carbon sink that absorbs a net 7.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is 1.5 times more carbon than the United States emits annually. A standing tree is a carbon sink, and protection of old growth trees store more carbon due to their biomass, both above and below ground. The older the tree, the more carbon you store. A cut down or harvested tree becomes a carbon source because the removal results in a cease of photosynthesis and a release of stored carbon into the atmosphere during removal. This doesn't even include the emissions used in the process of harvest or to truck it off-site. While lumber used in construction holds on to any remaining carbon, and the downside is once the integrity of the wood diminishes, we again contribute to carbon release through the rotting and decomposition process. My rule of thumb is if it's old growth, it stays. If it's deemed hazardous, create a habitat pole. During planning and construction of auxiliary buildings and structures, source local, source sustainable, and source recycled. It just comes down to how you choose to manage your trees on site and incorporate mitigation processes in instances when lumber is necessary. Next slide. One of my favorite stories I love to share about the build of Sawyer's Corner in Skykomish is the play structure the city had envisioned. The lead of their parks department, Debbie, had gathered information on building a log jam to represent their historic logging industry. The mayor was panicked at the expense, and I was thrown into a meeting with Debbie to convince her that we could build the log jam sustainably and at a cost savings. Since our park build was planned around the concept of a naturescape, I embraced the concept and decided to walk her through the park. By the end of the meeting, she fell in love with using local materials from nature and recycled boomsticks from the logging industry to engage children in play and exploration, and as a way for them to learn about their history. We sealed the deal. The result was a locally sourced and sustainably built play structure that saved the city almost $30,000 in funds, reduced carbon emissions by eliminating trucking costs from across the country, and we eliminated a potential carbon source by recycling the boomsticks instead of them being burned or left to rot. The lesson learned, you have the power in how you manage your trees and your builds. Next slide. So where do you start? As we get more in depth with the landscape, is always important to keep reevaluating your plan and design with key factors of reestablishing tree cover and building a biodiverse ecosystem. Tree cover relates to the amount of area covered by woody canopies above 5 meters or 16 feet tall. In a landscape, whether rural or urban, this directly correlates to clean air, reducing flooding, and mitigating rainwater runoff. In addition, according to the United States Forest Service Climate Resource Center, trees in urban zones can have an important influence on carbon mitigation by reducing the energy requirements for building heating in winter due to wind protection and summer cooling from tree shading. For example, 3 mature trees spaced around an energy efficient home can reduce annual air conditioning demand by 25 to 43%. All the while, these 3 trees are acting as carbon sinks. Next, what do you plant? In rural areas, the tree cover is typically a lot more dense due to large tracts of land than an urban landscape. But if the end goal is carbon storage and mitigation, plant trees that grow fast, live long, and grow big. And always make sure to plant according to your base map's ecological zones and taking into account your regional environment. This will ensure better success and the increase of biomass sooner rather than later. Quoting Deanna Lynn, a landscape architect from the University of Oregon, increasing the functional diversity of trees and plants increases the potential carbon sequestration of the land by increasing productivity and resilience. I liken this to a support group or to a group of good friends. Through the relationships we build and the support we give one another, we become stronger. Functional diversity works in the same way. If we plant a community, the plants and trees will work in tandem to offset more carbon. And just like our friend groups, plant communities have dominant personalities and not so dominant personalities. The importance in planting here is that more dominant species contribute more to carbon storage, while the less dominant or complementary species have a symbiotic relationship that works with the dominant. Next slide. Soil is life, and life is symbiotic. Soil is all about relationships it builds. And just like any solid relationship, soil is there to support the community and to help it thrive. In other words, healthy, happy, nourished soil is what makes for a stronger friend group. The healthier the relationship soil can build with the least amount of disturbance boosts ecological functionality and the more carbon it can sink. Next slide. Just as standing trees store carbon above ground, terrestrial ecosystems sequester carbon below ground. The EPA states soils and plants make up the third largest carbon pool behind the oceanic and fossil carbon pools. And just like trees, the larger the underground biomass, the more productive carbon storage is.
Next slide.
Next slide. Let's go back to Sawyer's Corner. Throughout Sawyer's Corner in Skycomish, throughout the city and our park site throughout the city, our park site and the rest of the surrounding area, over 350,000 tons of contaminated soil was removed and remediated. As you can see from the image, soil was brought in, but reforestation and replanting didn't occur. Okay, that's what it didn't occur. Essentially eliminating the biomass it would have naturally had through tree and plant roots. The soil without any functioning biology became almost barren other than the weeds it was growing. The remediation happened, but a healthy ecological relationship was broken. Next slide. So how do we give our soil in the garden or at Sawyer's Corner a step up? We act like a national park and we mimic its actions. You reestablish natural soil functions and microbial activity processes through carbon farming techniques with the goal of creating the most optimal environment. While carbon farming is a practice adapted for agriculture, it can be used in your landscape just the same. For instance, amend soil organically through composting things like food scraps, leaf litter, and plant clippings on site, and use organic mulches such as composted manure. In other words, toss the synthetic fertilizers, which increases nitrogen, breaks up natural soil ecology, and harms the relationships microbes and plants have underground. Back to our friend group. Sometimes we all need a break, and much like this, soil requests that you just leave it be and do not disturb. In other words, minimize soil disturbance by using hand tools for digging instead of large machines, and if you can, don't dig at all. Trust and encourage its natural ecological processes. The community will flourish, and by changing our practices, we can build our carbon bank. Next slide. Farmers have a saying, plant one for the crows, which means you always plant with forethought and insight to your environment because the likelihood of some crop loss due to weather or wildlife is inevitable. So for instance, if a farmer wants to yield 150 ears of corn, they know that a portion of the corn is going to be harvested by the crows before they even get to their own harvest. With this knowledge, they plant 25% more to counterbalance the inevitable loss. Next slide. With this thought, according to soil scientist Deanna Lynn, prioritize covering soil with as much plant cover as possible because more coverage means more roots, which means more carbon storage and less soil left exposed. Longer-term carbon storage comes from an understory that is composed of several species of smaller woody specimens and perennials, which always makes it important to know your environment. Choose the right shrubs and perennials for that zone and the existing soil. The idea here is to know the environment you're planting in and to aim for multiple plant species that will thrive in that environment and ecology for the long run and that won't require high carbon inputs. In addition, be deep rooted like our friend groups. Select species that will increase below ground biomass and therefore increase the carbon sink. Planting the understory mimics the function of a park setting, in that all the plants form and maintain a symbiotic partnership with the tree canopy, forming a strong community that is biodiverse. The stronger our community, the more powerful the carbon storage. So plant more, increase biodiversity, be deep rooted, and form a community. Next slide. Be the change you see in the world and design, plant, and build it like nature did it. Everything is a park. At Sawyer's Corner, we reduced our carbon footprint by designing and planning, by identifying our local environment and around sourcing locally. We minimized heavy equipment use. We didn't dig down, we imported organic compost, and we built up. We reforested the tree canopy with endangered local tree species. We planted a diverse understory with deep-rooted woody shrubs, and we used salvage materials from the local area, such as boulders and logs. Every path we built was pervious, and we made friends, and we built a community. Next slide. What I learned from our project in Skykomish was by adopting a positive carbon approach is the understanding that all of our outdoor spaces are shared, and even more so our public spaces. Our practices affect others, and because it was one of Washington State's largest remediation projects, our design and build management was being held accountable. We have a responsibility. Everything we contribute ultimately impacts and contributes towards a positive or negative carbon footprint. Referencing the United States Department of Agriculture, urban areas alone in the continental United States covered approximately 68 million acres in 2010, nearly 3.6% of the land area. As a landowner, we can make lifestyle changes that will change the way large institutions and outfits do business, increasing our ability to increase carbon storage. What will be the lifestyle change you will be making to counterbalance climate change in the landscape and become a carbon sink? Next slide. Thank you. It's slow moving. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Huda. I appreciate it. I love Skykomish Park. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's wonderful. Before we jump into question and answers, I'd like to get to Jason. So we have plenty of time for our last speaker this evening. And then following Jason's presentation, we'll break for another question and answer session. Thank you again so much, Huda. We greatly appreciate your presentation tonight. And Jason, you have the floor.
All right, give me 1 second here.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Take
your time.
All right, how does that, can everyone see the screen?
That looks great to me. Looks
All
great.
right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nina, for this great evening. And I want to thank my other speakers tonight, Amanda, Hoda, and Steve, for their great presentations. I have a whole bunch of notes I've taken for myself, as well as for future ideas for other projects. So thank you again, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. For the education series. My name is Jason Jorgensen, and I've got a great talk, Dynamic Drought Tolerant Gardening in the Pacific Northwest. There are many routes and ways to design and create beautiful spaces. This is one that I'm starting to, let's see if I can turn my volume up. It sounds like there's some issue with the volume. Hold on 1 second.
You're sounding pretty clear to me.
Okay, I just saw a note here.
Yeah, there might be a function in the microphone.
Yeah, can you guys hear? Can you hear me fine, Nina?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So I've got this the talk tonight, Dynamic Drought Tolerant Gardening in the Pacific Northwest. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Jason Jorgensen. I'm a certified professional horticulturist. I've got a degree in landscape design and ornamental horticulture from Edmonds Community College up in Linwood. I'm also a qualified professional member of the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, Washington chapter. I know a few of my colleagues are on this call tonight, so thank you for your great support. And I want to thank, of course, all the other members who are here tonight to hear us speak. And I just am immediate past president of the Northwest Horticultural Society. It's a Pacific Northwest horticulture society based here in Seattle. It's the kind of the preeminent organization, and it's a great resource for people who are interested in gardening, or resources about gardening and hearing people speak for everything in this venue. So thank you again. Tonight's talk is it's a condensed version of a longer talk, so I may be going a little quick, so please bear with me. You can always contact me at the end if you have questions. We will do the Q&A at the end, as well as you can contact me directly. I'll give you my contact information. But basically, quick climatic overview, urban heat, island effect, water costs here in the Pacific Northwest, insect and wildlife habitat, summer dry gardening history, some resources that I use that I really enjoy, adapted plants, as well as a few images of some gardens that may give you some inspiration. So first off, just so everyone is all on the same page, this is a very detailed map of the world that breaks down the climatic zones so you can get an idea of why this type of gardening is appropriate here in the Pacific Northwest. And it's a very intense map. Austrian scientists have created this and classified all the different parts of the world. But basically, for our concern, we're worried about this warm temperate, summer dry, and then the temperature here, hot summer and warm summer. And to be more specific, here are regions in the world that have hot summer Mediterranean climates. West Coast US, West Coast South America, the Fynbos of South Africa, some parts of Australia, and then the Mediterranean, Turkey, etc. And then these are the warm summer Mediterranean climate regions. So now you're really honing in on the Pacific Northwest, larger areas of South America, larger regions as well, further up north of the continent of Europe, Middle East, as well as some extended parts of Australia, as well as New Zealand. And as you know, I mean, this is from last year, you know, we're having these extreme weather events. I think this is not going to be an uncommon thing now in our future. You know, excessive heat in the summer. And what typifies those regions throughout the world is that they get their rain events in the wintertime, like we do, and then they're dry in the summer. So as you all know, here in the Seattle region, we have, you know, our hottest times of the year, July, August, June, July, August, and then our lowest precipitation. And kind of inversely, you can see like November, December, we have the higher, and sadly, during Amanda's talk, she spoke about having a dry February. So once again, you know, this is a time of year that we should be getting more rain to kind of sustain the plants that we need in the drier months of the year. And another reason why this would be a very beneficial cost benefit for homeowners, people who are doing design, builders who are building properties for urban areas. As you can see, Washington State or Seattle has probably the second highest. This is a report from 2015. I don't have updated information, but it is from a great website. It's called circleofblue.org. And by those numbers, you know, between Atlanta being the highest and Seattle being the second highest water cost in the United States. Some of that's attributed to newer water systems, costs of infrastructure, et cetera, cost more now than when some of the older cities like New York, Boston, et cetera, were built. So those costs are passed on to the consumer. And once again, you know, we're talking about look at these low temperatures that we were having earlier this year or earlier last year during our heat events, you know, some nighttime temperatures. And so those, you know, stress plants, a lot of urban built environments have a lot of excessive heat. And so those areas don't cool down. And so that leads us to this urban heat island effect. This is an image of the port of Vancouver. And as you can see on the left is a image of kind of the hardscape built environment, warehouses, concrete, etc. And then you can see some green spaces up on the north, or excuse me, the top and bottom section of this image on the left. And then here is a kind of a image of the heat and reflected heat, the purple and red being the highest. And then as you get into more reflected heat, much like what Hoda was saying with trees being a extremely beneficial and helpful way to counteract that heat island effect. And of course, This is a kind of a vicious cycle because urban heat island effect affects, of course, most of us live in a built urban environment. It increases our temperature, overall ambient temperature of the environment. I even noticed this today being in Seattle, but having to go over to Bellevue. Inversely, with the cold weather, it was much colder over there. We have a slightly moderating effect from the water here in Seattle, but there was a 5 to 7 degrees difference. That being said, let's get back to the heat aspect, not the cold aspect. But so in those heat island areas, it takes more energy to cool spaces. And then those disturbed environments, buildings reflected heat from concrete. And then, of course, those built environments can't absorb the stormwater that comes when it does rain, and it gets flushed out to basically the sound through either the storm sewer system or through the sewer system. And, I sadly think that, I mean, this is another kind of call to action for summertime weather, with these excessive heat events, which I think will continue, sadly, for generations to come. Getting alerts to not go outside, between 10 and 4 p.m., which is really kind of scary. That being said, just another quick little graphic of the temperature difference where you have a rural environment versus a downtown built environment, and you can see that you've got the concrete, asphalt, reflective light from glass, as well as the heat absorption from concrete, which then takes, basically acts like an oven, and then it radiates throughout the evening. And so those temperatures don't drop down as frequently or as quickly as they would be in a green space or a place with more organic material like trees, forests, parks, parklands, street trees, etc. So you've all been in an urban environment, downtown Seattle, in the evening, a nice hot summer day, and then you sit there and you actually can feel like you're sitting next to an oven. So that's one aspect of that heat island effect. And so that just gives you the background of why this style of gardening and the plants that I'm suggesting in this talk are appropriate for built urban environments. It's a nice contrast or kind of halfway measure between creating a space that takes a lot of water resources, which I think we should be saving those water resources for agriculture, for drinking, for medical, etc. And I don't think most homeowners should be spending as much watering and maintaining high water intensive gardens. Lots of inputs cost a lot of money. This is a quick little background of the history of summer dry gardening. Excuse me. And just a quick, this is the woman in the little roller cart. Her name is Beth Chatto, amazing horticulturist, sadly has passed away, but she wrote a book called The Gravel Garden. Her property now is a park in England, public park that has amazing resources to educate and teach people about low water use in their gardens. And this is the driest part of England, so I think a lot of people may think England, has summer rains, etc., more East Coast style weather. But this region in Essex, which is northeast of London, is the driest part of England, much similar to what we have climate-wise. And she pioneered this kind of utilizing weedy plants as well as self-seeders and plants, right plant, right place that can adapt to the climate that they're growing in. And so this is this kind of very loose, naturalistic manner. right plant, right place, and and she was also a very ardent advocate for organic and environmental efforts. And I think all of us who are here tonight are also in that mindset that we of course are fully embracing, or not embracing, but fully ensconced in the Anthropocene, and we are doing our best to deal with climate change and insect and wildlife degradation, and really trying to utilize what we have and make some effective change for our lives as well as for future generations. And so this garden here, this was the original parking lot to the garden that she ran out of space for the garden, and so she decided to turn the parking lot into a garden. And the book that she wrote eloquently talks about how this extremely dense mucky clay, which I think a lot of people who are building homes here in the Seattle area or the Puget Sound area are running into areas with clay. So you can do a lot of amazing things with heavy clay water retentive soil. But this is this really beautiful outdoor space, really amazing. I was really fortunate to visit. It happened to be in July of 2018 when they were having an extreme heat event like we have now been experiencing here in the Northwest every summer. They hadn't had rain for, she was saying, 85 days. And this garden is looking pretty good for being something that's not watered. Some more just quick images of that garden. There are more parts of that garden, but this, I was particularly interested in these summer dry garden sections. And there are lots of plants. I mean, there are plants here from the US that are growing in the UK. And so believe it or not, even agaves, we've got plants from South America. So this is kind of a collection of plants from those regions that, that can grow in our modified Mediterranean climate. And just another quick little image, very loose, lots of early self-seeding flowers, bulbs, etc., that come up that do very well in those types of settings. And I just put this up. You'll get a recording of this, but I won't spend too much time on it. But this image here is this drought-resistant planting. That's the new title for the book, but it was also called The Gravel Garden. And that was her book. And these are resources that I use as a designer, and I even as a homeowner or someone who's interested in researching more about what type of plants and type of gardening they can do that is sustainable, I think is really great. I just actually heard Doug Ptolemy speak on the East Coast again, and this is a really great book as well about designing for biodiversity, which is, I think, something that all of us need to fully embrace. And planting design, but then a lot of these authors are also very cognizant and aware that we're building in disturbed urban environments, and so we have to think outside of the box for plants that can survive in those situations. Another reason why, of course, we're very interested in doing this style of gardening is to attract pollinators. I mean, bees, wasps, flies, moths, butterflies, etc. We all need them. They are the keystone to food production, and not just the European honeybee, but I'm talking about the solitary bees that live in the ground that are not hive dwellers, etc. Bumblebees here in the Pacific Northwest. So these are reasons why you would want to do this style of gardening as well. And this is just a quick image of a park that used to be a railroad in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they had this really amazing pollinator kiosk I thought was amazing. And of course, this is a very fashionable, and quite a few of my colleagues here in Seattle are creating really exceptional examples of these pollinator kiosks or bug hotels, as you like. And one really interesting thing is they had this great infographic here about, you know, percentage of bees, and these are native that they're talking about, and this is for the U.S. You know, 70% of bee species nest in the ground. Only 30. You know, you can see the different nesting methods. There are over 4,000 different types of bees in North America. You can see how many trips a bee makes to a nest, etc. And you know, so these are key components to creating a sustainable landscape and creating an environment where we can have pollinators, insects, bugs, wildlife in our spaces. I mean, this is a really amazing dahlia, you know, blooming in a client's garden. You know, a couple summers ago, it's pretty amazing to see the diversity of wildlife that we have here in the Pacific Northwest, and being able to provide a great space that they can live and be in. Another reason I think a lot of people are very interested when I speak to potential clients, you know, first thing they're interested in is creating bird song. This is my favorite bird. I have a suet cage outside of my office here at my home, and I love seeing them. I hear them chatter, and I think I click, let's see if this plays, because this is, I mean, who wouldn't want to have this, be able to hear this at their, and as you know, they just, you probably have heard them in your gardens right now because they're quite active. I think of them as my like little gray marshmallows that are climbing around. They're all, they live in nests, you know, in big groups, troops of bush tits, and you know, they fly around and they sit upside down, and they're all over the mahonias right now that are blooming, and they go from bush to bush to in big masses, and they actually nest together, which is really interesting. They do a communal nest. But just to keep things short, I've kind of edited this down, but I have some genera of plants, plant families that do very well in this style of gardening. We've got roses, some that are particularly well adapted to summer dry, Rosa mutabilis, Rosa glauca, and Rosa rugosa. I think this image here is of the Rosa glauca, sometimes called the blue rose. That's a really lovely plant. A little contrary to, of course, what Amanda was saying with fire, mahonias or manzanitas, arctostaphylos are also very well adapted for drought tolerant locations. Once they're established, they are pretty bulletproof. Just don't plant them so close to your house, or if you're in a fire area. I guess that's one thing. I don't know much about firescaping, so so you just have to bear with me and you know, pick the appropriate placement for plants. Plants in the Cistaceae, so the cistus, the rock rose, those are also wonderful plants that do well. They're amazing pollinator attractors. A lot of the very tiny, these kind of metallic green bees, they're tiny, I mean, smaller than like your pinky fingernail, just a really small bees, and they pollinate zucchini, and they pollinate other cucurbits, and so they need food before those are blooming, and so this is something that blooms in late spring to early summer. So those plants are very appropriate in that family, as well as these genera. Stuff in the mint family, we've got salvias, phlomis, lavenders, thyme, Prosantera, teucrium. There's a lot of plants in this mint family that are very appropriate, that can handle our summer dry periods. Myrtles, Leptospermum, Luma, eucalyptus, callistemon. Those are also very good plants to grow in those situations. There's a few more of the plants in the mint. I think I edited this out, but I didn't. Stuff from Australia and New Zealand in the Proteaceae, Grevilleas, Lomatia, and Bothriem. If you go around to any of the big urban parks, you'll see some really good examples. Seattle University has quite a few amazing Embothrium, which is a Chilean firebush is the common name. And those are really amazing plants, hummingbird attractors, grevillea. I have some grevillea in my own garden that are blooming just like this image you see here on the screen. And the hummingbirds have an amazing source of nectar this time of year, along with the mahonias that are blooming right now and the insects that they eat on the mahonias. Plants in the Asteraceae, so the aster family. We've got these beautiful echinops, globe echinops. So we got Eryngium, Berkia, asters, Solidago, Catenacci. These are all amazing genera of plants that, of course, you can see attract pollinators and can do well in low water situations. Tulips, as everyone knows, we're quite famous in Skagit for the tulip area, but tulips originate from Turkey, Middle East, and so they as well winter rain, summer dry. So if you're having problems keeping your tulips coming back year after year, you might think that you're doing something wrong. It could be that you're in a place that's getting water when they need to be dormant in the summer. So think about how these do very, very well and have been starting to naturalize in some gardens that I've designed and are looking great, and they come back year after year. All types of irises, whether they be the bearded irises, the wonderful Pacific Coast hybrid irises that will be blooming in early spring, tulips, Aromaris, which are these beautiful foxtail lilies, Scilla peruviana, which is not from Peru, but is in fact from Europe, and some very small minor bulbs that come up, but are amazing for the early pollinators to keep them going until bigger plants are blooming in the mid-spring. There's an image of a Pacific Coast hybrid iris, which is a hybrid of the Iris 10X and Iris, there's one other Iris native one that is self-hybridized. And of course, the breeders now are going crazy, breeding all of them, creating amazing colors and leaves, etc. And then, of course, like self-seeding annuals and perennials, Nigella, some euphorbias, they, of course, be cautious. They do have a yellow or a stack. They have a sticky, milky substance that can be allergic to some people, so caution on that. But it is nice to incorporate those plants in the gardens because you can kind of let them self-seed and then they'll start to create smaller and smaller colonies and will reliably come back. And here are like some of the nurseries that I'm sourcing plants. Some of them are wholesale. Most of these places are retail, but you'll get a copy of this when the recording goes out. But Zero Plants in Portland, it's amazing wholesale and retail nursery. Sistis Nursery in Portland, Desert Northwest in Squim. Greenlee and Associates is wholesale only. They do a lot of the grass seeds, grass starts, plugs, small that are easy to plant and establish. Annie's Annuals out of California, out of Richmond, California is great. TNL Nursery, which is the local wholesale nursery on the east side, but if you go to any retail nursery, TNL, you'll notice that name on the plant tags, and that's a great local company. Van Englund Bulbs and Brent and Becky's Bulbs. If you bought bulbs for spring and you haven't got them in, you still have time. I would say get them in as soon as possible. I still have a couple boxes that I need to get into a few clients' gardens because of the snow event. I wasn't able to get them in. And just a couple quick images of some gardens. This is what inspired me. This is actually my client's garden who started and actually corresponded with Beth Chatto. And this is her garden up in northwest Seattle. It hasn't been watered in, it's going on 17 years. And what we do is when we establish a new section of the garden, we will fully water it for the first year. And then after that, we don't water it. And so it's to get the new plants established. And I'm using this technique for all of my other installs in this summer dry gardening method. And it's kind of, you know, you know, the ones that survive, and the ones that die. But we're having a very good retention rate or survival rate of plants, and you know, we're averaging on 85 to 90% survival rate. So it's a great way to install a garden, get it established, and then you're just kind of letting nature take its course. Here's a couple more images. And of course, this looks very much like that garden that you saw at the beginning of the presentation at Beth Chatto's. And, you know, it's a really good mix of perennials, woody plants, evergreens, as well as native, as well as introduced plants. There's another image here. And, you know, these gardens are really doing well. I am extremely amazed, and I'm very optimistic that this is a style of gardening that can happen in the Northwest without a lot of input. And, you know, these plants are not getting fertilized. They're not getting watered. I mean, there is the maintenance aspect, which is a cost that's associated with having a garden. And so then those overall cost of a garden is lessened. And you're starting with smaller plants because the survival rate with the smaller ones in this gardening method is much more, is a lot higher. There's just one more quick shot. I'll quickly go through these because I know you guys are probably very tired. It's been a very long day, and we're having a great event tonight. And then this is just the final shot here of that garden. And then lastly, then I have one more garden I want to show you. So this is actually my garden. So after working with my client, I decided to bite the bullet. You can see this is a typical Seattle kind of summer garden. You know, the grass has gone brown. You know, your typical squared and boxed hedged. And I decided to bite the bullet. I got the sod cutter, took up the sod, repurposed it in some raised beds in my vegetable area, so nothing went to waste. The plant out, and then here, this is what it looks like. This is not last summer, but the summer before. And so all that stuff was planted, watered just the first year, and then it's on its own. And and then just one more shot of that, of my garden, you know, that's doing amazing with no water. And I think this is something that we need to think about as we build and create spaces in these built urban environments. We really need to be cognizant about water, where it goes, how we're using it. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. And if you'll get this as well, but if you need to contact me, feel free. You can got my email, phone number there. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, as well as I do have a podcast as well. It's called Always in the Garden. And I have a couple episodes about summer dry gardening. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jason. What a lovely, lovely garden. Absolutely
Great.
stunning.
Yeah, thank you. Here, I'll stop share. Here we go.
Gorgeous.
Here we go.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, to you and to Huda. I'll open it up to questions now for the two of you. And thank you again so much for your time and for your incredible presentations to the both of you. That was so informative. Thank you.
Great.
I have a question. So watching this, I know that the fire dangers are very important and about keeping, plantings away from the base of the house. But I find that some people take that to extreme, and all of a sudden they just want to start cutting trees down and not have the ground cover. Like Jason, it looked as though, and what I've gone for more is having a cover over the soil, because the ground heats up a lot if you don't have continuous planting with permaculture and different things like that. So I think it's a fine line, and I'm having a little trouble kind of deciphering how we view that from this presentation about balancing, this continuous, growth of underbrush where, the birds and the animals need that cover, versus having these big open spaces to protect ourselves from fire and other damages. Can you kind of address that a little bit?
Well, I'm not knowledgeable about firescaping or creating. I think Amanda's talk was seemed more geared towards rural environments, and I think my style of gardening, as well as my practice, is working with built-in urban environments where that fire danger is not as high, or maybe almost zero. Although there was that amazing fire in Colorado in a very built urban environment. So who's to say that we're not going to have those type of events in cities? Hopefully not, but who knows? I'm not, I do use like a gravel mulch for these gardens. And as you can see on the two examples I showed, using a gravel mulch. I'm not using, and that kind of speaks to what Amanda was saying, using like a rock base or gravel base around the perimeter of your house. I'm looking at it from my standpoint is that in kind of this urban environment, that you're trying to create as much organic material around to help mitigate heat and water. So that's how I look at it. And of course, you have to decide for yourself, if you're a homeowner, or if, say, you're designing a space for a client, what your comfort level is. Hopefully that gives you a good. All right.
So I could probably add a little bit to that, I think, if you don't mind, Jason. I know the question was directed towards you.
No, I think it's very appropriate for your talk too.
Well, it's appropriate, I think, for all of the talks, because it comes back to, I think, everything and all these subjects, tying together as a whole. So we need to look at all of that, and we really do need to know, like Amanda was probably talking about high fire risk areas. Jason is talking about a non-high risk fire area. So it goes back to that first step, I think, of researching your environment, knowing the ecology, and then basically counterbalancing everything all at the same time, right? So like you can use different pruning techniques, for example, to have trees, but keep them off of your house, right? You could think about your landscape and say, I want to have a woodland. Where is it appropriate? Because in Amanda's map, there were different, there was the 5-foot zone, the 20-foot zone, the 30-foot zone, so it's really basically land management, taking your land and figuring out what's appropriate. And I think that some of it, we just need to start thinking about, how are we going to get back to where we were before? So yeah, xeriscaping is great, and I love it in coastal strands, but is that the most appropriate thing to be doing, for example, in Seattle, which is actually more temperate and is further away from the coast sometimes? We have all these different microclimates. So it's playing to those microclimates and acting and doing things and planting things in layers. So it's super important to know your ecology, to know your soil, to know what your end goal is, because I think you can have it all. But it comes down to researching plants, researching trees. Like, for example, a lot of people will plant, dogwoods in the middle of a really, full sun area, when a dogwood is actually an understory tree. Like when you look at our indigenous cornice, it is actually living understory under, fir trees, cedars, and everything else. They don't grow out in the sun. And that's why they always look like they're about to die when they're planted in full sun. So it's knowing the plant and researching it and taking that time, because at the same time, we want to counter climate change, right? And the reason why we're talking about xeriscapes and drought tolerant plants is because we're getting hotter, right? So,
Yeah.
but with carbon sequestering and stuff like that, we're actually saying, let's step it back. Let's like rebuild our forest. Let's do agroforestry. And so you can look at those large scale corporations and see what they're doing to mitigate, and then you just add it into your landscape, right? So like the no dig, for example, so we know that when we dig in the soil and we disturb it, that we're basically creating a carbon source, right? So plant on a mound. So it's just different techniques, and we really didn't have too much time to go into all of it. But research is what I would recommend, and know what, the biodiversity is and what the ecology is of the place that you live. That's my 2 cents.
No, that's very good. No, I agree. I mean, like what I'm doing in Seattle or in the Puget Sound area, I'm not amending any of the soil. We're using what's on site. We're making a very cognizant choice to not fertilize, to water minimally, and to create this habitat for, the biodiversity. I mean, there's this great, there's a biodiversity audit the corporate event, people go there, and there was in fact a group of scientists, insect research scientists, who were at this event, and then they weren't so interested in the garden, but they took a break and they walked around and they realized that this was like a rich biodiverse space. And they have this document, I can put a link on there, of this biodiversity audit that they did at this place of a built environment. I mean, it's a garden, so there's a collection of plants from all around the world. And it was like the most diverse part of England. And they saw species of insects they hadn't seen for 50, 60 years. And so I think that there's this interplay. I mean, I love the fact that in more rural areas, that there's this very cognizant aspect of retaining and preserving as much of the natural environment there is. But if you look at a built environment like Seattle, a very hard concrete built environment, I don't think you can, unless you can get a whole development to buy in to create like a reforestation aspect, I don't know if that would really, if you can get that same impact. Maybe you can speak to that, Hoda.
Well, so I feel like that is one of those subjects where, I back in the day, I actually used to work for Greenpeace. And one of my biggest things that I used to tell people when I would, knock on their doors and talk to them about actually forest canopies and what have you, was that, they have the same thing. I'm one person. But I would always say, well, I'm one person, you're one person, so be the example. Right.
Yep.
So you have to start somewhere. And sometimes it's just taking that step and saying, okay, here we are in Seattle. This is what the climate was. This is what the environment is. I want to counteract climate change, or I want to have a sustainable garden. How do I get there? And so maybe you do have a space for, a Doug fir. Maybe you have a space for something that's a little bit more columnar, but it's just knowing your local flora and fauna. And, I really believe that you can be one person that, infects everybody else. So just because not everybody is doing it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it at all. Because what we're doing is we're changing the environment by not looking at ecology and not looking at biodiversity and saying, I'm going to be an active participant.
Yeah. Well, I I agree with you, but then I also I feel that with climate change that we're already ahead of that curve, or we're behind the curve, and we've got to do something to preserve the insect and wildlife habitat that's here. And by including natives in these gardens that I'm designing, as well as other of my colleagues, I think it's I think it's a good halfway measure.
Well, so that's a mitigation approach, I think,
Yeah.
which is great, and it's totally honorable, and I'm not ditzing what you're saying, but I think you have to look at the whole picture, not just part of the picture.
Yeah.
And so most of the plant material that I saw in your designs, I use actually a lot of them, and I actually really like a lot of them. And I use them in particular spaces that can be like substitutions for things in like coastal strands, like the manzanitas, because they're in the same family as the madrones. But it comes down to, again, looking at the ecology and planting the right plant for the right space. And so that's where we go. I come from a science background, and more than I come from, just a landscape design perspective. So I try to be as holistic as I can be in that thing. But most of the plants, like I said, that I saw in your xeriscapes were beautiful, and they're plants that I use all the time. But they are going to contribute to changing some of our native habitat. So you can plant things that are native, and you can plant trees that are native that also are great for the insects and the birds and the butterflies and all that kind of stuff. But what we have things that are happening above ground, but we also have things that are happening below ground. So it's a whole package. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I also feel that by incorporating those plants, you're also making sure that the homeowner or the builder is happy with the final product as well. So
We have another question in the chat. This question is for Huda. The built up dirt at Skycomish, is that a design thing, or is that tied to the philosophy of don't dig if you don't have to?
Well, so don't dig if you don't have to is actually a pretty big philosophy of my design aspect. In Skycomish specifically, I mean, it was a remediation site. So Burlington Northern was dumping a lot of toxic waste into the soil there and into the river. So even with it being remediated, we were still seeing, like, when there would be pools of water, because we wound up putting in a rain garden at one point, you would see streaks of like oil, for example. And so I kind of had this, the strike of my conscience, because I knew kids were going to be playing in that park. Like, that was being built a lot of the way for them. And so my thought with it, when I started thinking about it and trying to go through all these different things that pull toxins out of the soil, like mycelium and everything else, was, the best thing to do is to just leave it. Right. And so don't dig, build mounds, create kind of a landscape that is contoured towards the surrounding mountains, and do it that way. It is a philosophy that we use all the time. And it's because in the landscapes that I do, sometimes there'll be really mature trees, for example. So if you dig down, you're basically hitting a big root zone that you don't want to destroy because of biomass and because it harms the trees. Right. So I will often bring in soil, and I will build mounds and contour to what's there. So I look at the natural landscape and I decide how deep the mounds would have to be, before I plant and before I dig.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There is another question for you, Huda. Can you talk about the role of compost in a landscape, and how it may or may not affect the landscape's ability to capture carbon? You talked about bringing compost into soil at Skycomish.
Yeah, so Skycomish was another. So I mix my own dirt. And so basically what I do when I go on site is I do a soil evaluation to see what is there and what the content of that soil actually is before doing an import. In Skycomish specifically, I didn't really have, I didn't really have, my vendors were too far away basically. And I was like, am I really going to truck like 3 hours to get the dirt that I'm typically used to having and mixing? So I did some research and I found some people that were local that could basically provide me with an organic compost that is leached and composted before it goes into the garden. So that was kind of how we found our compost over there. And it's organic because it's, there's a mixture of like dairy manure and fish castings and things like that. And then just regular compost. So in Skykomish, we used horse manure, which I don't typically use in the landscape. But that was the only choice that I had, and it was local and it worked. So I think depending on the environment and the things that you're planting determines what kind of compost you use and how rich it has to be in organic material. Because organic material does sequester carbon, right? So it's the things that you get in artificial composts that aren't so good, right? So that's where you have the problem, because you have like a lot of nitrogen, gets added to a lot of fertilizers that are synthetic. You don't really have the same thing when you have something that's just, basically coming from a dairy farm. Or if it's like the duff in the Northwest specifically was created because of actually our wildlife cycle. Eagle flies down, catches the fish, he eats what he eats, then he drops the bones in the forest, and then a coyote comes and eats part of the carcass or whatever, and then the rest of it decomposes and goes back to the earth. That's our natural process. So when I'm mixing soil, I'm looking for a natural process so that I can rebuild that layer of duff, because that's why it's so lush and that's why it's so green. But if you're doing things like a xeriscape, my mix is totally different, because on a coastal strand, you have a lot more sand, for example. You have the sandy loam and those kinds of things. So having something that's really rich in organic matter, it's not necessary, right? So the biggest part, I think, with soil is just try not to disturb it. If you're trying to really increase your carbon footprint, it's like, think of different things and different ideas. Let your leaf litter compost into the soil, or if you're going to pick it up, have a composting, bin or something like that on site. So it's composting in that bin, and then you're putting it right back out into the environment, because that's the natural process. So did I answer the question?
Yes, no, thank you. That was super helpful.
Like, I feel like I rambled a lot, but
no, that was awesome. Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. How does someone evaluate, and this is for either the two of you, how does someone evaluate their current yard landscape to determine what is best to do it as a DIYer? Are there readily available resources out there, or does someone need to resort to hiring a professional to provide an evaluation? And Helen, I noticed you posted that in the main chat. Feel free to add or elaborate on your question.
I think it's appropriate. You could do either. I mean, there are great resources available. I posted on my slide deck. People will see some of the books that I use as reference material. I highly recommend the Doug Ptolemy book, the wildlife book. That's a great resource. There's also, I'm just quickly looking over on my bookshelf. There's another one. I'm just going to step away. I'll grab it. I can barely see from where I'm sitting. There are some really good resources for creating wildlife habitat, as well as like learning about the different plants. But it's the living landscape. This is a great resource for creating wildlife habitat, as well as native plants, and incorporating those into a garden.
Great, thank
so
you.
to add to that, I think that we have some really great resources actually that are free if you want to be a do-it-yourselfer. I'm a super big fan of the Center for Urban Horticulture. which is right in Seattle. Super nice people. They love, answering questions. The Arboretum is another really good one. I started as a do-it-yourselfer, believe it or not, before I got my job at Heronswood. And what I used to do was I used to just get like the National Horticultural Society's books. So it was always going to like some of those big like organizations that is kind of their main focus. And they can direct you to even anybody who will do like a free consultation if you don't want, there are a lot of really great workshops. Seattle is like a really great resource for some of those things, because there are permaculture workshops that are out there. The ISA is huge in Washington State, so you can take classes and learn about trees and pruning. And they have a great blog, and they have some really good free resources on their website. So that is kind of the approach that I would take.
Thank you.
And I'd put the link to the Elizabeth Miller Library there for the folks, which is a great resource, which Hoda was speaking about.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then we have one last question here that I'm seeing in the chat. When you're planting around trees and you don't want to dig around the roots, how much dirt can you add above the roots, or how high can those mounds be?
Do I get to answer this, Jason?
You can. I know what my answer would be.
Well, no, you can answer it too. I'd have, so I always take a look at the canopy of the tree. I take a look at the canopy of the tree, and I take a look at the root flares at the base of the tree, which is kind of a clear indication of like, if I'm going to be digging, I know where I can go. The other thing I do is I keep a good sized well around the base of the trunk of the tree before I plant anything as an understory. And then I'm really cognizant of what will be able to have a symbiotic relationship with the tree itself. Because obviously a big giant Doug fir is going to soak up a lot of water.
Yeah.
So you're probably going to want a drought tolerant plant, woodland plant that you're going to be planting there. So younger trees are easier to kind of deal with just because they don't have the girth as a larger, older established tree. But we typically, I call it fake natural in the garden, because if I am importing soil, I have a technique where I basically just sprinkle a little bit of soil in the outskirts of the well and inside the well to make it look like I've added soil there. But in fact, I really actually haven't, because obviously the ground is actually where the tree actually breathes, right? So below ground is where trees breathe, even though a lot of people think it's through their leaves. So if you bring too much soil to the trunk of the tree, what happens is you basically it's like a slow suffocation. So if you can kind of steer clear of it and import the least amount of soil, the better.
Exactly. And make sure that root flare is not covered up. And a lot of times, and this is something I'm doing, and I'm sure you're seeing that as well, Hoda, is that the previous installers of plants and trees have basically planted the plants too deep and have covered up that root flare by 6. I've even had to create mitigations to get water away, because they're so deep and they're so permanently planted, you can't get them out, and a way to get the water away from the crown as well as remove the soil. It's really unfortunate.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll leave it open if anyone has any last questions for Jason and Huda. Thank you both again so much for your wonderful presentations. If no one else has any questions, I'm going to reach out to the speakers of tonight's event and see if folks are comfortable sharing their contact info with with our participants this evening. So if you have any follow-up questions or want to connect for a project, I'll definitely provide folks with your contact info. And of course, you can find it in the recording, link to the recording as well, which will all be posted next week. I know it's late, but wow, I gotta say what wonderful and chock, filled information we had tonight. It was really great. I really enjoyed the topics that were discussed and covered, and I can't thank you all enough for your time tonight.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see y'all at the next event. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening. Thanks again so much.
Bye.
Bye.